It's rare to find a game that's as highly regarded and plagued by issues as Knights of the Old Republic 2. Like its predecessor, it distinguished itself as an exceptional RPG, one that is celebrated even today as one of the best. It achieved success with its storytelling by exploring areas and themes of the Star Wars universe that had previously been either untouched or barely explored, resulting in a darker, more philosophical narrative that further expanded the Star Wars universe. Yet, for all of its accomplishments, KOTOR II is an incomplete experience. The game suffered from a 14-month development cycle that saw significant content either cut or not fully developed. Numerous bugs and other issues remained in the game when it was released back in 2004 due to a mix of poor planning and simply not enough development time. While KOTOR II is far from unplayable, the problems that have plagued this game are obvious to any who play it. This is a game I've played through numerous times over the last 16 years, and I enjoy it every single time. But with every playthrough, I notice more and more of these issues. Certain sections that feel rushed, quests that bug out for one reason or another, conversations where characters either don't face you or have their dialogue drowned out by the music. These are things that would bring most games down, yet for some reason, KOTOR II still manages to succeed. It's remembered as an excellent RPG rather than a technical disappointment with a sometimes rushed narrative, and I think that's a testament to what Obsidian was able to achieve in such a short period of time. This will be the first of a two-part look at Knights of the Old Republic 2. This video will take a look back at KOTOR 2's development so that we might understand a little bit more about how this game ended up the way that it did. The second part will take a look at the game's story, themes, and legacy and examine how it manages to be so exceptional despite its issues. This is Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2. To understand KOTOR 2's development, we need to start by understanding why Obsidian developed this game instead of BioWare. After all, the first Knights of the Old Republic was both a critical and commercial success, so you would assume that BioWare would have jumped at the opportunity to make a sequel. In fact, the company actually did have some ideas for a sequel that they had been working on. In an interview with Eurogamer back in 2017, KOTOR's lead designer James Olin gave some insight into what BioWare had been planning. The player would essentially be trained by a Yoda-like figure, who would end up being the main villain by the end of the game. This was their attempt to try and make a twist similar to the Revan reveal from the first game. As we all know, BioWare never ended up making that game. The heads of the company ultimately decided to move forward with creating their own IPs instead of continuing to work on properties they didn't own. This single decision had significant consequences, which is funny when you consider the fact that the idea of consequences ended up being a central theme of KOTOR 2. It can be said that BioWare's decision to turn down KOTOR 2 resulted in the Mass Effect and Dragon Age franchises, which themselves are also praised as excellent RPGs. This decision also effectively put Obsidian on the map and established them as a respected game studio. When BioWare passed on making KOTOR's sequel, they recommended that Obsidian should make the game instead. At the time, Obsidian was a brand new studio that had just been founded earlier that year by former members of Black Isle Studio, which included Fergus Urquhart, Chris Avallone, Chris Parker, Darren Monahan, and Chris Jones. When Obsidian was hired to make this game, there were only 7 people on the team working out of a makeshift office in Fergus's attic. They were also told that they needed to have this game finished in time for the holidays in 2004. This gave this newly formed small team of developers only 14 months to put together the sequel to one of the most highly praised games of all time in the universe of one of the most popular franchises of all time. No pressure, right? To top it all off, Obsidian wasn't even allowed to play the first KOTOR ahead of its release. They started preparing the story for the sequel without knowing anything about its predecessor. Once they finally got their hands on the game, they realized their story didn't fit BioWare's at all, which is not surprising considering they knew literally nothing about the game beforehand. They also realized, along with everyone else, how great Knights of the Old Republic was, and that following it up was going to be a monumental task, especially considering the time constraints they were working under. They ended up throwing out their ideas and starting over with the first game's story in mind. One of the first things lead designer Chris Avallone did was consume as much Star Wars as possible to understand more about the Star Wars universe. He rewatched all the movies that were out at that point and read the various novels and comic books that had been released. There's actually something he said in a designer diary back in 2004 about his Star Wars research that really stood out to me. He said that if you're working in someone else's universe, know it inside and out. Know what's been done in it, know what adventure seeds or game ideas have been done to death or not done enough, know what bad ideas to stay away from, and know the parameters of the universe. As a huge Star Wars fan, I respect the hell out of this. Star Wars is one of the few things I'm very protective of, probably more than I should be, and it bothers me when I see people make things in this universe that don't seem to understand what Star Wars is all about. Seeing someone devote themselves to understanding a world they didn't create in order to make something that does that universe justice makes me extremely happy, and I respect Obsidian for putting in the time and effort when making this game. Another thing Obsidian did early on was identify the areas of KOTOR that they could expand upon. They basically followed the mantra of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Instead of redesigning systems, Obsidian looked for ways to enhance them. A great example of this is the skill system in KOTOR. The first game introduced a set of skills that were used to accomplish a variety of tasks, including disarming mines, picking security locks, and hacking into computers. Every time you leveled up, you would receive skill points that you could distribute amongst these skills however you wanted, allowing you to customize your character to fit your playstyle. Obsidian decided that this system worked well in the first game, but that it was underutilized. To expand on it, they decided to add a crafting system that made use of the different skills. You could make healing items and stims with the treat injury skill, mines and grenades with the demolition skill, and item upgrades with your repair skill. This gave the player more of a reason to care about and invest in different skills when creating their characters. Obsidian didn't add or take away skills or change anything fundamental about the skill system. They simply enhanced the system with new ways to implement the skills you were already familiar with. Another good example of this was the way that Obsidian handled balancing. In the first KOTOR, every place you looted had the same items in every playthrough. When you open a footlocker on Manon, for instance, it will have the same items in it every single time you open it. Similarly, enemies are at fixed levels on each planet. Regardless of the current level of your character, enemies will not scale with you. Because both loot and enemy levels are predetermined for the entire game, it potentially leads to some issues during the open part of the game. After you leave Dantooine, you need to travel to 4 different planets to search for the star maps: Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manon, and Korriban. You can visit and complete them in any order you want, which gives the player the freedom to create their own gameplay experience. The problem is, the developers didn't know what order the player would visit the planets in. By making everything fixed, they opened the possibility of the player acquiring high-level loot earlier than maybe they were supposed to, making subsequent loot finds less exciting or even worthless. The player may also end up over-leveled for certain areas, making some encounters less challenging than they were intended to be. When Obsidian saw this, they decided to update these systems to adjust based off the player's progress. This excerpt from a post-mortem written by former Obsidian senior designer Kevin Saunders does a great job of explaining this. He said, "In KOTOR II, we implemented a random item placement system. Every item has an effective character level for which the item was designed. Each area of the game, upon first entering it, is stocked with treasures appropriate for the player's level. We included a small random chance for a particularly powerful item and incremented this chance each time a powerful item was not found. When a powerful item was placed, this random chance was reset. This meant that, no matter which planet you traveled to first, you would find level-appropriate items that were different in each playthrough. Even the linear sections of the game had loot randomly generated that differed each time. In my latest playthrough, I came across the Baron Donovis robe while exploring the Harbinger. This was a powerful item I was lucky enough to find early in the game. In all my playthroughs, I've never had that drop for me so early, which speaks to the effectiveness of Obsidian's changes." Saunders went on to talk about the balancing they did for enemy encounters. Upon entering an area for the first time, the difficulty levels for all placed creatures are scaled based on the player's level. We differentiated between 5 degrees of scaling to meet various needs and used controlled tests to set the levels of difficulty to appropriate starting points. Auto-balancing was modest for common enemies so that you feel that they're consistently gaining power throughout the game. For bosses, however, auto-balancing was more extreme. We wanted to encourage players to try new tactics and use different items to defeat these opponents. By making these changes to loot and enemies, Obsidian was able to make the game adjust based on the player's choices. It leveled with you and provided useful loot at an appropriate pace. At their core, these systems remain the same. You still loot the same way, and you still fight enemies the same way as in the first game. However, these behind-the-scenes changes greatly enhance those existing systems, similar to how the skill system was also enhanced. With these and other enhancements in mind, as well as the Star Wars research they did and the story of the first Knights of the Old Republic, Obsidian proceeded to make KOTOR II. They had an ambitious plan for their 14-month development period. They wanted more planets, larger areas, more cutscenes, and more dialogue. They basically wanted to take what was done in the first KOTOR and add more to it. Like I said before, Obsidian wasn't trying to redesign the entire game. They were trying to build upon the foundation that BioWare had already laid. Unfortunately, that ambition ended up working against them. 14 months is not a long time to make a video game, and Obsidian's eyes were bigger than its stomach. They realized late in development that they weren't going to be able to include everything they wanted. Things had to be cut if they were going to finish this game on time. This isn't anything new, as game development regularly involves cutting content from the final version of a game for a variety of reasons. The issue here was the short development cycle. Obsidian realized they wouldn't be able to finish everything late in development, so they kind of had to scramble to figure out what needed to stay and what needed to be cut. Additionally, there were several issues that popped up late in development that Obsidian didn't have enough time to properly fix. For example, cutscenes often performed in unpredictable ways, with programmers spending countless hours finalizing cutscenes only to find them broken for unknown reasons. This is an issue that carried into the release of the game, as I can personally attest to certain cutscenes not functioning the way they were intended. There were also features and systems that ended up making their way into the game that weren't as developed or polished as Obsidian wanted. In the post-mortem I mentioned earlier, Saunders addresses this as well. Many of the new game systems did not receive significant polish time. Instead of being well-refined systems, the final implementations were essentially rough drafts with design flaws that we were able to identify but not address. Features like the influence system, where you would gain favor with companions depending on your decisions and answers, ended up in the game as lesser versions of what they were meant to be. Even things like the enemy balancing I mentioned earlier didn't go as well as Obsidian wanted. They weren't able to fully play through the game until shortly before the game's gold date, at which point they noticed that they had made combat easier than they had intended. This undermined what they had been trying to accomplish, but there just wasn't enough time to correct it. Looking back at all this, it's easy to paint LucasArts as the villain. Most people would agree that 14 months is simply not enough time to properly create a game as expansive as Knights of the Old Republic. You would think that, given the success of the first game, LucasArts would want to make sure that this sequel was just as good, if not better, and make sure it had the proper amount of time to achieve that goal. However, the release date seemed to be non-negotiable. In an interview with Eurogamer back in 2018, Chris Avallone mentions that there would have been substantial penalties for Obsidian had they not shipped the game when LucasArts wanted them to. It makes you wonder why LucasArts was so strict about this. Why was it such a big deal that this game released by the end of 2004? While I don't think we'll ever get a definitive answer, we can do a little speculation. LucasArts underwent some restructuring during the mid-2000s under their new president Jim Ward, who was appointed in April of 2004. At the time, many Star Wars games were being produced by external studios, such as Pandemic Studios, BioWare, Obsidian, and Raven Software. This restructuring led to LucasArts shifting focus from external development of Star Wars games to internal development. This resulted in numerous in-progress Star Wars games being cancelled around 2004 and 2005. Only a handful of games survived the cut, such as the original Battlefront 2, Republic Commando, and the Revenge of the Sith video game. Knights of the Old Republic 2 also survived the cut, but you have to wonder if this move to restructure had some impact on the development of the game. The pressure from LucasArts to finish the game by the end of 2004 makes a little more sense if you consider what LucasArts was going through at the time. Now, I do want to point out that LucasArts isn't necessarily as big a villain as they may appear to be here. Obsidian certainly doesn't think so. Multiple developers for KOTOR II have come out and said that Obsidian had been too ambitious when developing this game. They knew from the start that they only had about 14 months to develop this sequel, and these developers took responsibility for not planning well enough. They could have focused less time on unnecessary things like minigames and instead focused more time on things like polish. LucasArts also lent a hand in bringing KOTOR II to the finish line. The developers mentioned that LucasArts sent over QA people to help and performed crucial work getting the game's cinematics together. Kevin Saunders even goes so far as to say that, without the extensive support from LucasArts, a game of this caliber would not have been remotely possible in little more than 14 months. It seems to me that KOTOR II was simply a victim of forces that were outside its control. As a result, its true vision was never fully realized, and we were all left wondering what this game's full potential would have looked like. However, despite the development issues it faced, KOTOR II still turned into an exceptional, if flawed, game. It has, in my opinion, one of the best Star Wars narratives ever written, one that stands shoulder to shoulder with the first game's story. It really is impressive what Obsidian was able to accomplish when you consider the obstacles this game needed to overcome to get released in the first place. This marks the end of part 1 of my 2-part look at Knights of the Old Republic 2. In my next video, I'm going to take a closer look at KOTOR 2 and discuss the game's story and themes, its legacy, and what makes it so exceptional despite its issues.